You're about to listen to the food programme. Before you get stuck in, I want to tell you about some changes we're making to where you can find the latest episode of this podcast. If you're in the UK, from Friday, February 28th, you can hear the food programme a whole week earlier than anywhere else, first on BBC Sounds. If you haven't already, you can download the BBC Sounds app to listen to the food programme. It's easy. Once you're there, you'll find even more podcasts that are available on Sounds before anywhere else. Just search for the food programme, subscribe, and we'll send you a notification every time a new episode is available. We'll see you there. Now, let's get back to the podcast. This programme is about a word, one that in recent years has become attached to more of the food we eat. It's a word, I have to admit, I don't fully understand, which is why I decided to make this programme. And when our first speaker came across this word, he also had questions. His name is Ken Giller.
I'm British. I've been working at the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands since 2001. I've worked particularly in soil science. I was professor of soil science at the University of London, University of Zimbabwe, but in the Netherlands, I head up a group called Plant Production Systems.
And as head of that group, Ken's role is to ask some of the biggest questions about food.
Like global food security, how do we achieve that? The problems of hunger in Africa, how do we address that? So those are the sort of the big questions that we try and address.
It was in 2019 that Ken Giller first came across the word. He'd been asked to attend a meeting about sustainable food sourcing by one of the world's biggest food companies, Unilever.
I was the only agriculturist in the room, and everybody was talking about regenerative agriculture. I was, well, what on earth is going on here?
And that's the word, regenerative, or regen. And it kept coming up at the meeting. And Ken, the agricultural expert in the room, wasn't entirely sure what it was describing. And so when he returned to his office, he started to look.
We did a very rapid quick scan, and it was everywhere in the news, in social media, nowhere in the science literature, because it had taken off in a different space, if you like.
Everyone seemed to be using it, from the smallest of small-scale farmers to the biggest food corporations in the world, from NGOs to government departments of agriculture. But what Ken couldn't find was an agreed definition. And so, in 2021, with colleagues, he published a research paper, Regenerative Agriculture, an Agronomic Perspective. He looked into the origins of the term, how it was being used and by whom. And Ken wanted to understand if regenerative agriculture was the answer the world needed to many of its food problems. Or was it just an exercise in greenwashing? And what was driving the rise in the use of the term?
We found actually that the explosion of the use in the news media really took off in 2015, 2016.
Some of the conclusions in Ken's paper about the rise of regen were positive, but he also argued that without an agreed definition, there was also the potential to confuse rather than clarify public debate around food. And more importantly, there was concern that the buzz around an undefined term might draw attention away from other big food challenges the world faced. And as soon as the paper was out, Ken's phone started ringing.
When we published our paper on Regen Ag, one of the first responses I had was from a big company, and I won't mention which one because it's an embarrassing comment. And they said, we just committed $3 billion to this regenerative agriculture program. Can you help us define what it means? And I said, well, sorry, guys. What we normally do is, first of all, we define what something means, and then we commit to it. Isn't it a bit late? But it's even within the companies, you've seen the marketing people have rushed ahead with something. And then the people on the technical side are rushing, how on earth are we going to actually try and meet these promises that we've made from the company?
Ken, I've made hundreds of editions of this programme. This is the first one dedicated to understanding a word. Am I about to head down an obscure rabbit hole, or is attempting to explain what regenerative agriculture means important?
I think it's a really important question because of how pervasive the term regenerative agriculture has become. I think that we are often not aware of how important language is when it comes to these things, because we tend to use terms very glibly, and they're often terms which give us a very warm feeling, but we don't necessarily understand the full implications of what they are.
I don't have £3 billion riding on the outcome, but I do want to end this programme with a clearer understanding of what the term means. And there is, in fact, a lot of money riding on regen. Governments around the world are shaping agricultural policies and subsidies featuring the word. More of the companies supplying our food are using the term, and there's genuine excitement around the world about what it represents. And so I do think the question at the heart of this edition, what does regenerative agriculture mean, really does matter. And let's start by going to the source.
The facilitators of agriculture in the future are going to be what I call meta-systematicians, who are not limited by a specialist focus, who are into systems, but a much broader concept of systems than we have now, getting into the spirit as well as money, resources, and whatever. And that's my prediction for today.
This is Robert Rodale, a deep thinker, a publisher, agricultural expert, and one of the main exponents of organic farming in the United States, as was his father, J.I. Rodale, who'd been inspired by the ideas that started to emerge in England in the 1940s, including those of the botanist Albert Howard and then Eve Balfour. And Robert picked up the baton.
I spent the first 30 years of my life promoting and working with organic farming, which says to farmers, don't use any artificial fertilizers, any synthetic pesticides, and have a very close relationship with a consumer who appreciates what you're doing.
By 1989, when this interview was recorded for the United States National Agricultural Library, a year before his death, you get a sense that Rodale was in search of a new language that could capture an alternative food future.
It's time now to invent a concept, a way of talking about these possibilities, these opportunities for environmental, social improvement with all farmers. And that means not asking them to convert to an extreme organic system, but a stepwise conversion into a lower input system. I prefer the idea of a regenerative agriculture. I'm not satisfied with the term sustainability. I think it's very appealing to policymakers and scientists because they think it's simple and they can understand it. But I don't think the average person aspires to live in a sustained environment. They want to live in something that's expanding and going better. So I think the idea of regeneration is more appealing.
Someone who'd spent time with Robert Rodale in the US in the early 1980s was Lawrence Woodward, founder of the Organic Research Centre in the UK. And the context, the time, the place for the emergence of regenerative agriculture is important.
This was a particular thing for the situation in the US, and especially in the Midwest of the United States, where you have big, big fields, no hedgerows, no field margins, and a system that had developed of largely monocropping on soils that had become very fragile. And they were subject to erosion. Once the grassland had been ploughed up, tremendous drop in organic matter, and the soil was blowing away, was disappearing, and along with it, the fertility. So their practices developed, which actually at that time was called conservation agriculture. And there was a whole series of technologies that were very akin to organic. And a lot of farms in the Midwest were converting to organic from the late 70s onwards. But they were doing nothing around the farm. And that's where Bob Rodale, who was head of Rodale Research Center, is now seen as the godfather of regenerative. It was about regeneration of ecosystems all around the farm, and regeneration was being achieved within the farm by organic farming methods.
Use of the word then fades away for a few years, only to return a decade later.
It wasn't until the 1990s that the term, again in the US, the term regenerative started to be used again. Again, largely by farmers who were in the Midwestern states, who were bothered about what was happening to their soil. And some of the things that farmers were talking about were very much organic techniques. The use of cover crops, intercropping, introduction where possible, introduction of livestock back onto the land, and a greater balanced, more mixed farming system. There's also, as there's always been with organic, a cautiousness about tillage. Organic farmers have never followed the intensive tillage practices that conventional farmers developed. But the regenerative farmers in the US took that a stage further and developed the idea of minimal tillage or zero tillage.
That emphasis on reducing and even stopping tillage, the act of disturbing soil for planting, along with the more intensive practice of ploughing, in which the soil is actually turned over, became a key principle for the regenerative movement and eventually, as Ken Giller explains, caught the attention of the world's biggest food companies.
In around 2016, 2017, a lot of companies started to see the term, and then there was this explosion of use among all of the different food companies globally. You know, people like Nestle, Unilever, Danone, PepsiCo, more recently Guinness. You know, everybody taking this term on board. And I think on that side, it looked like there was a shift. They needed something new. People had been talking about what was then sustainable intensification, and the idea that we needed to increase yields and increase productivity and in a sustainable way. And in a sense, that's a sort of a do no harm approach. And I think the framing of regenerative agriculture gave them a positive vibe. So we can turn it from being producing more and not doing harm to producing more and doing better for the world at the same time.
And in the UK, one of the ways, in fact, possibly the main way in which farmers and food businesses have been introduced to regenerative agriculture and practices associated with the term is the annual farming event, Groundswell. Each summer, thousands of farmers, food and technology businesses gather at a farm in Hertfordshire to see demos, hear from experts, and exchange ideas, all of which can be linked back to the thinking that took off in the United States in the 1980s and 90s. Groundswell was founded by farmers John and Paul Cherry, but it was another member of the family, Alex, who showed my colleague, Natalie Donovan, around last year's Groundswell.
My dad and my uncle, John and Paul, started farming 35 years ago, 40 years ago probably, and they had taken over the farm from their grandfather. Their father was an architect, and so they were 22 years old or something when they started, so they didn't really have any preconceived ideas. So they were lucky to be a little bit more open-minded, and it wasn't working. Conventional agriculture wasn't working for us. So inspired by No Till on the Plains conference in America, my uncle in particular became completely impassioned by soil health. And why wasn't everyone talking about this? It was just mad. No one was providing information. The industry didn't want to change because the industry likes the status quo. So that's where Groundswell was really born. It was us saying, come on, we need to bloody talk about this, and we want to learn how to do it because we can do better.
Can you explain to people who haven't heard that term or don't quite understand that term, what do you mean? In what context do you talk about regenerative farming?
Regenerative farming is a bit of it's a phrase that hasn't quite been cemented in terms of the definition, but basically we are trying to farm with nature to improve it rather than extract from it. So there is all forms of agriculture here, whether it's small-scale market gardening or whether it's large-scale arable farming in the east.
What does help bring us closer to an understanding of regenerative farming are the 5 principles that can be found on display around the Groundswell site. And they are: 1, don't disturb the soil; 2, keep the soil surface covered; 3, keep living roots in the soil; 4, grow a diverse range of crops; and 5, bring grazing animals back to the land. And what you can see and hear at Groundswell reflects those 5 principles, including the very latest technology capable of drilling seeds into the ground with minimum soil disturbance.
So we're entering the Groundswell demo field here, and you're looking at the leading direct drill manufacturers in the UK. These guys are selling these drills all over the world. And that's one of the reasons we have such an international audience. People are coming here to see what we're doing in the UK and then exporting these drills back to all over Europe and the world. Some of them are very expensive. The one we're looking at there is probably £120,000. But then you've also got some very smaller machines, 3-metre machines that are much more affordable. And in the background you can see our herd of shorthorn cattle that are being regeneratively grazed. So they're being mob grazed in cells with electric fencing, where they get moved every day, sometimes twice a day, onto fresh pasture. And that is actually an arable field you can see the cows in, that's been fenced and put into a 4-year herbal lay, a restorative herbal lay. So this is part of our regenerative long-term rotation. There'll be lots of different things in there that are fixing nitrogen, providing diversity for the soil, providing diversity for pollinators, and crucially the cattle absolutely love it. It's like a salad bar for them.
Amazing.
Yeah, and then after 4 years that will go back into an arable field, and hopefully we'll get a very good crop of wheat off it without having to use so much artificial nitrogen fertiliser, if any at all.
And you're pointing at the cover crops. What are these? These are beautiful flowers and poppies.
Yeah, Kings are the groundswell cover crop partner, so they've got a lot of expertise, and they sell all of these cover crop seed mixes that are now part of the sustainable farming incentive subsidies that the government are offering. Farmers are paid to grow these cover crops as part of their rotation. So it might be you're putting it as an overwinter in your field to keep the ground covered, to increase diversity. It keeps in the soil, it keeps a living root at all times. Otherwise, traditionally, you just leave your stubble until it gets cultivated, and then it spends all winter as just bare soil, which is absolute madness. You want to be photosynthesizing all through the winter, and that's what a cover crop's doing. So there's probably 30 different varieties here. We're looking at oil radish, there's buckwheat, winter oats, vetch, berseem clover, phacelia. It's got a lovely sprouting purple flower. There's mustards. The list goes on. This is a 40-foot mobile chicken coop. So there's lots of farmers who've converted their horse box into a chicken coop, and it's a great way to follow the cattle round in your regenerative rotation, because the chickens come out of the coop during the day and they love to scratch around in the cow pats. You want to ideally get them 4 days after the cows have been through, because that's when the fly larvae are at their most plump in the cow pats, and the chickens love to go and eat the fly larvae. And they also spread the poo out, and it gets eaten by the worms better and goes down into the soil. So it's a very happy, diverse strategy for improving your pasture, and the chickens absolutely love it. Their eggs are the best eggs you'll ever eat. So, and this is the first bit of kit come over from Germany, and it houses 400 hens. So it's slightly we're seeing cottage kind of ideas suddenly starting to become quite industrious. It's sort of regenerative agriculture becoming industrious, it's quite scary to see, but it's also fantastic.
In another part of the groundswell site, a section of land has been excavated so people can see what lies beneath the surface as plants grow and life flourishes within the soil.
Tell me what we're looking at.
So it's about 1 metre deep, and we've got a herbal ley growing on top, and you can see the roots of the herbal ley going through the clay on the surface, and then they hit chalk about 1 foot down, and the roots are still going through the chalk, looking for moisture, right in the sort of bedrock, and it's illustrating the power of those roots and the power of photosynthesis. Imagine that carbon that's being captured in the atmosphere and locked into the soil, and it's also increasing the structure of our soil. It's improving the aggregation. It's allowing percolation of water to get deep into the soil, and then into the aquifer below, which makes our local water company, Affinity Water, are very happy, which is one of the reasons why they're here as a sponsor of Groundswell, and are supporting regenerative agriculture in a massive way. And what we're doing is we're building the topsoil here. So, if we continue with this methodology of farming, we should start to see the topsoil growing. It's obviously going to happen very slowly, but incrementally. That's regenerative. We are regenerating our soils, and that is going to feed us well into the future. It's not easy, it's not plain sailing, but everyone's on that journey of trying to make it happen.
Among Groundswell's 8,000 attendees are people who've travelled from all over the world, including influential farmers from the US, who've done most to popularise the term regenerative agriculture.
So, John Kempf is arguably the world's leading voice in regenerative agriculture. He hosts the Regenerative Agriculture podcast, which is from his farm in America, and he founded a company in 2012 called Advancing Eco-Ag in America, which is solely supporting regenerative practices through agronomy advice and nutrition, and they are farming over 4 million acres. So he's never been to the UK before. He's never spoken in the UK before. He's come here specifically, flown across the Atlantic to come to Groundswell. That is a huge honour for us, and his welcome. I mean, people were unbelievably excited when he got onto the stage, mainly because no one's actually seen his face before. Because of his Amish roots, he doesn't like to have his photo taken, and everyone's heard his voice on the podcast and lots of other interviews. So when he got onto the stage, I think everyone was very impressed with his immaculate beard, and he's a serious businessman as well. That's what I love about him. He's very commercial. Oh look, here he is. You can see him walking over here. Hi, John. How are you guys doing?
How are you finding it so far?
I believe that in order for us to facilitate change in the adoption of regenerative agriculture, the best way to achieve that is for everyone to share what they know. Every farmer knows something that other people would benefit from knowing, and I think Groundswell facilitates that community remarkably well.
And when did you first hear of the Festival of Groundswell?
Oh, I've been aware of the festival for a few years, but this is my first year attending. For that matter, it's my first year in the UK, first time in the UK, yeah. So yeah, I'll be presenting on how to manage plant nutrition to grow crops that are resistant to diseases and insects, and how to rapidly and immediately improve farm economic performance so that we can have an immediate positive economic return as soon as we begin transitioning to a regenerative agriculture model. There are so many ramifications of regenerative agriculture that when we have positive economic responses, in this regenerative agricultural system, that gives growers a significant incentive to change. But the benefits of regenerative farming are that we also produce healthier, higher quality food that can regenerate public health, and we can regenerate ecosystems. So there are multiple layers of benefits that everyone benefits from.
John Kempf at Groundswell talking to my colleague Natalie Donovan and Alex Cherry, director of Groundswell. Another attendee, and someone who's described his food and farming business as regenerative, is Andy Cato. Famously, he's the former member of Groove Armada who sold his music rights to pursue a passion for growing food. In 2018, Cato co-founded Wild Farmed, a mission to create a network of farmers all motivated by producing good food and looking after their soil.
Well, I think Wild Farm was definitely conceived as a way to regenerate landscapes at the same time as growing quality food. At the beginning, we weren't applying the word regenerative to it. We were just doing that. It was a kind of an evolution of a farming system that I'd been working on for many years, where we were seeing, quite significant soil biodiversity improvements at the same time as growing food, which people were finding very tasty. So we were just doing that. And the umbrella term of regenerative followed on from that. And it was really actually listening to John Kempf, his podcasts, the Regenerative Agriculture podcast. So that was the first sense that I got that this was a movement, not just in UK farmers, but around the world.
In this programme, Andy, I'm looking at the different ways in which regenerative is being used, and also to try and understand what exactly is being regenerated. How do you answer that?
Well, that's the million-dollar question. I mean, in a wild farm perspective, it means quality food, it means farming for nature, and it means farmer fairness. So I suppose at the heart of it all, this is about regenerating relationships all up and down the supply chain. So you've got between plant roots and the soil microbiome, between the farmed ecosystem and the biodiversity that we need to bring back to it, between farmers and food buyers, and the food processors and all the intermediaries in the food chain. It's basically trying to move from a linear extractive model to a cyclical model that can sustain us into the future.
If people were expecting you to have answered that question by saying, oh, it's all about soil, you're saying it's far more than that.
It's more than that. I think what's happened over the past few years is that regenerative has gone into carbon myopia. And I think we need to really push back against that. And so from a wild farm perspective, we guarantee 4 outcomes for our customers. One is pesticide-free grain. One is improvements in biodiversity within the farmed landscape. One is improvements in water quality, and one is reduction in carbon emissions.
But what do you mean by carbon myopia?
The carbon myopia, you when you're in conversations with people about what they want the food system to supply to them so they can tick the right box, is essentially a reduction in carbon emissions, because that's the one thing that people are being obliged to report on. And it's the thing around which people have had a stab so far at creating value. So it fits very neatly into the kind of the spreadsheet requirements. But actually, the idea that we can have a food system which isn't based around rich and abundant biodiversity is ludicrous. So a big focus for us is making sure that nature is front and center of any kind of regeneration, because if nature's there, if you're farming for nature, then you're going to be doing the right thing by carbon too. But the same thing does not apply the other way around.
And so is regenerative a helpful term for you now?
I went into a procurement meeting the other day, and head of a procurement for a big food business, and their opening comment was, our customers aren't interested in regenerative farming. And I said, you're probably right, in that most of them will never have heard of it. The few that have heard of it will not know what it means. And even people who are in this world will disagree wildly about what it means. So in that sense, you're spot on. But your customers are bothered about rivers that they can swim in, or birds and bees, or for an ability to use their food choices to become part of the climate solution rather than part of the climate problem. So your customers are desperately bothered about regenerative agriculture and all the things it can possibly do. It's just that we've got to find a way of communicating what a silver bullet this can be if it's properly applied.
And what do they say?
Well, we're still working with them, and they're asking us to help them frame their cereal procurement. So the meeting got off to a better end than the beginning.
Andy Cato of Wild Farmed. But as we heard earlier from Ken Giller, who has researched the rise of regenerative agriculture, major global food brands are also using the term, including the biggest food and drink company in the world, Nestle, which last year had a turnover of around £80 billion. This begs a question. Are we seeing a genuine shift in agricultural thinking by a business at the very heart of the global food system, or is this a form of greenwashing? According to Emma Keller, head of sustainability for Nestle in the UK and Ireland, under the recently appointed CEO, Laurent Frex, regenerative agriculture is going to be the way forward for Nestle. But what does it mean?
Any major food business or a business that depends on agriculture absolutely has to start looking at soil. That's the very foundation, has to start looking at farming practices. So a really positive thing is that this has been recognised by the CEO, who sees that if we don't make this step change towards more regenerative farming practices that put more back into the soil and into the farming communities, then we simply won't have a business. And a business like Nestle that's been around for 155 years wants to be around for another 155. So we have to do it. So we've got that commitment right from the top. As Nestle, we've made a commitment to source 50% of our ingredients through regenerative agricultural practices by 2030. And that, if we achieve that, we'll be sourcing more than 14 million tonnes of agricultural ingredients through practices that are enhancing nature and restoring soil.
And as we head towards 2030, what kind of practices will Nestle be shifting towards? What are some specific examples?
Intercropping. So rather than monocultures and one crop in one field at a time, growing other crops that can help to replenish the soil or take nitrogen from the air and put it back into the soil to avoid them having to use synthetic chemicals, etc., right through to mob grazing, which is quite a sophisticated practice on a livestock farm where you move the cattle around, so you allow the field a chance to regrow and really restore that biodiversity and that nature. And we've been working in the UK through a partnership with a milk supplier called First Milk. And with them, we have a regenerative milk plan, which supports and rewards farmers to take on these more regenerative practices. So essentially, we pay for the milk, and we also pay a sustainability bonus as farmers start to evidence that they're doing these practices.
And to be clear, some people will hear the term regenerative and might think it's a vague, airy-fairy concept. But what you're saying is there's also a hard-headed business reason behind doing this.
Yeah, I think as a sector, as a food sector more generally, or any kind of key actor in the food system, we've recognised more acutely than we ever have before the dependence that we have on nature and the dependence on a healthy, thriving kind of environment and ecosystem. And I mean, we can look at it now with things like climate change impacting many of our crops worldwide. We've seen obviously wildfires happening in the US. We've seen floods and droughts across Europe. We've all had to face at some point an empty shelf because we couldn't get hold of tomatoes or olive oil. Or at the moment, the big one we're facing is cocoa and coffee prices are going up. And that's largely, there's a whole load of supply chain things happening, but there's largely a big result of climate change impacting the growth and the yield of these crops. So I think all businesses are waking up to this reality. We know climate change isn't something that's going to happen in the future. It's happening now. And if we don't address it, we don't invest in our farms and our agricultural systems to be more resilient, we're only going to see those impacts get worse and worse.
But what works for wheat, dairy and cacao in a Kit Kat isn't necessarily going to be relevant to other crops. Take another company using the term regenerative, McCain. Founded in Canada in the 1950s with a turnover of around £8 billion a year, it's the biggest buyer of potatoes in the UK. And when it comes to the regen principles we've been hearing about, potatoes are tricky. James Young is Vice President of Agriculture at McCain.
Well, at the very basic level, the fact that the tubers are growing underground, we have to disturb the soil to get the seed in a lot more than many other crops. I mean, that's common to other root vegetables, of course, and some other vegetables, but compared to a lot of crops that growers are producing, cereals and so on, then we do have to disturb the soil a lot more to get the seed in. And then actually when it comes to harvest, obviously, as well, it would be underground. So just in those traditional practices, potatoes are seen as quite intensive and high disturbance of the soil, which could have a negative impact to biodiversity and to that soil health. So we're trying to change that. You can't fundamentally change it and start growing them above ground, for example, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying to do some things a bit better and trying to do things in a friendlier way and just try and reduce that disturbance and that impact. And that's exactly what we've been doing the last 3 or 4 years since we've started terming it regenerative agriculture.
But what does the term mean in the context of McCain's supply chain? Give us a specific example.
The growers are now using cover crops a lot more than they ever did. So the soil is covered, we're planting potatoes in the spring, the soil's covered from the previous crop, the previous autumn, far more than it ever used to be. The numbers of cultivations, I mean, this is the real key one for potatoes, reducing the numbers of passes of the fields and the soil to help get the seed in the ground is a great example. So there's some technology out there that means you can get the seed in the ground with fewer passes and fewer cultivations of the soil than we used to. But it's coming down. Slowly but surely. So, this isn't an overnight change, Dan. This is reimagining the way that we grow potatoes, and it does take time.
James Young of McCain. So, different examples there of businesses using the term, but delve deeper, argues Ken Giller, and you find what appears to be a contradiction in the regen approach.
There's a huge emphasis on no tillage, minimum tillage or zero tillage. And yet at the same time, we're supposed to reduce agrochemical inputs. Now, if you don't till, what do you do about the weeds? So a lot of zero-till agriculture is heavy dependence on the use of glyphosate, on use of herbicides. If we do away with herbicides, how do we control the weeds if we don't till? There's a real contradiction there. And I think that tillage, obviously, tillage can be very damaging if done in a bad way and can cause soil erosion. But tillage is actually one of the tools in the farmer's armory with which you can actually control weeds with using less chemicals, yeah? So there's a contradiction there.
Lawrence Woodward.
So the glyphosate thing became a large part of what became known as regenerative agriculture. But also at the same time, unlike organic farmers, many of these, in inverted commas, regenerative farmers were still prepared to use fertilizers and fungicides. So it did not evolve as a system that was separate from agrochemicals. And these days, in many cases, regenerative farming continues to be based on agrochemical use.
But the counter-argument, Lawrence, and perhaps even as Rodale himself suggests, was to bring more farmers, more food businesses into a process of change. And also, it's about measuring outcomes, such as soil health or levels of biodiversity, rather than setting out a specific protocol.
I very much welcome the fact that now we're talking about soil health, and we can expand that conversation to talk about health of other things. And I am full of admiration for the Cherry family and others who created Groundswell. There's great information there, hugely, hugely important. So I do welcome that. However, as regenerative has developed, it's become not just a marketing cliche, it's also now a policy cliche. It's a policy cliche amongst agriculturalists, in government, in the research community. It's everywhere. And it's a kind of, essentially, we can have all these wonderful things without really changing anything. And I think there's two ways of doing that. One is it displays an incredible amount of reductionist thinking and ignorance. Two, I think it displays a huge amount of deceit. And people are essentially told, you don't need to make real changes in order to bring about real change. We can pretty much carry on. Now, that's deceitful greenwashing, because it's not regenerative. I mean, there's very little that's regenerative about just doing min-till.
Lawrence Woodward, whose work remains focused on organic principles. For our last contributor, I headed to the heart of the Cotswolds to meet Jonty Brunye at Connigree Farm as he spread bales of hay for his herd of 40 glorious-looking Hereford cows. Over his 3 decades of farming, Jonty's adopted all kinds of different labels, and even though his mixed farm is very much organic, it seems that the description that today is making him most excited about farming is regenerative.
For the whole of my career, I've been practicing what I would call sustainable agriculture, nature-friendly farming, organic farming, conservation. I was a FWAG, a Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group advisor, gapping up hedgerows, doing field margins, looking after species-rich grass. Loved it. But I became a Nuffield farming scholar 2014-15, and I travelled the world looking at sustainable farming, and I travelled through America. And it hit me right between the eyes that regenerative agriculture is where we need to be, because we've been so depleted for so long that sustaining, conserving just isn't enough. We need to go beyond that. We need to rebuild. And so my business, my ethics, my vision really sort of pivoted towards regenerative farming and regenerative thinking.
Weren't you already doing that? Much of that? It might have been called organic or conservation agriculture, but surely a lot of the components that you were hearing about in the US weren't new to you.
They were new. Regenerative agriculture goes beyond sustainability, beyond conservation, beyond basic organic principles, and it's complex. But I must be careful here because there's different types of regenerative agriculture. We have regenerative light, which is, minimum tillage, not using the plough so often, using some cover crops. Brilliant. That's a great start. But what we really need is regenerative deep. If we look back 10, 20 years, 30 years at the start of my career and the farming that I saw around me, we were farming for nature, not with nature. And what I saw across the States and Canada and Australia too was farmers that were farming with the environment, building those synergies. And what did that look like? Well, I saw soil being enhanced. I saw plants that were thriving and growing really well and really healthy yields with less inputs. Really healthy animals that didn't need vet medicines, and they were thriving off of grass-fed, low-input systems. I saw more wildlife, more biodiversity. I saw more resilience.
You're also in a program with some of the biggest food companies in the world. So I've been speaking to Nestle, McCain. Are you part of the same movement?
Good question. We all want the same thing, I think, which is sustainable businesses, great food, profit, net zero, more biodiversity. I think we want the same. Now, the way we go about it is different and the scale that we do it is different, but maybe we are part of the same movement. And that's quite controversial because the agroecologist in me is a bit of a rebel, and I don't always want to be associated with the big players, but I'm not against it. You know, the consumers will spend most of their money in supermarkets, so we have to engage at that level. The big players know that if they don't look after their soil, their farmers, their farm systems, they won't have any commodity to sell either.
At the end of this programme, I'm definitely clearer on the origins, the history of regenerative agriculture. I'm also clear on the 5 principles, and I know which of these some of the biggest food businesses are now adopting. But there's something that I still find somewhat beguiling about how wide an umbrella term it can be. But perhaps that's my problem. Perhaps I should be seeing it as a process that food producers of different kinds can join in different ways and at a different pace. And that's why I think it makes sense to give the last word to Robert Rodale. From what he has to say here, perhaps he was also wary of searching for watertight definitions.
What is sustainability and what is regeneration? It's laughable when you talk to conventional scientists today and they say, well, the ball is in your court. Define sustainable agriculture. What is it? So people start saying sustainability is this, that. Nobody's ever asked them, what is conventional agriculture? Define that. The definitions are important, but they're not of overriding importance. I mean, you could just go out and do it.
Robert Rodale on the importance of action over definitions.